Track podcast. We have Joseph Trapanese, who is a great composer who most recently did the Witcher series. We here at FFM Music had the honor of working with him and his team. So, Joe, pleasure to have you here on board. Hello.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's our pleasure. Let's just get started. So you've had this amazing career. You've worked on Tron. You've worked on The Witcher. You've worked on Straight Outta Compton, The Greatest Showman, Shadow and Bone, also TV series. So TV series, films. But first, when I watched the Tron Legacy, the first thing that came to my mind when I was listening to the soundtrack was who did the orchestrations and the arrangements.
That was certainly a pinch me moment, as we might say in English. Like am I dreaming that I get to do this? My goodness. I have to say that project for me really was like the culmination of a lot of things that I wanted to do since I was younger. Was combining electronic and orchestral. Being so passionate about orchestra and learning so much about the orchestra, learning the formal composition and orchestration and arranging, and getting to apply that in a situation. I think as I get older, the more I realize how incredibly fortunate I was to be in that situation where I could apply my skills and talents kind of in a bubble, protected from the industry almost, where Daft Punk was very much their goal to create this like little utopia of making a film score. So they like stopped touring, stopped everything, and then built this studio that we worked in that was like in a place where no other film composers were. We were on the Henson lot here in Los Angeles, which is the old A&M Records building. So it's more of a recording studio. So we were siloed away there. And so I really got to focus on exactly that, arranging, orchestrating, applying those skills that I learned for many years. And I would even take part in sound design and helping program the synthesizer. So it really was this magical collaboration that now that I'm older and I get to be more of a of a lead composer myself, or where I'm actually very much interfacing with the studio and the filmmakers and whatnot. I sometimes miss those days because I was super protected by Daft Punk, and we had, again, they worked so hard to create this little utopia and create this sound. And obviously, one of the big reasons why that worked is because the music was so damn cool that they had written. So obviously that's a big factor. But, now that I'm older with, deadlines and schedules and projects, the more I cherish those days, now well over 10 years ago, where I was able to kind of apply my skills in this very almost like protected oasis setting.
And I suppose that working with Daft Punk, it's been because your music, I would say one of the, from my perspective, one of the coolest things about it is that the unique voice of your electronics, if of your synth sounds. So, what was the feeling of working with a band that's actually mostly popular about doing stuff like this? And
Well, that's something, electronics. I've been playing with synthesizers since I was 13, and so I really have, I think that was one of the reasons why Daft Punk hired me, because they saw that I had a tremendous love and respect for electronics, that I wasn't going to come in and just have an orchestral tilt. I think that's one of the problems that could have happened, is that, and I see this happen all the time, and I'm guilty of it sometimes myself, where, I come into a production late, with an artist or something, and the orchestra is kind of like an additive element versus an organic element. And since, and if I might be so bold as to say, because all my life I've been playing with synthesizers and I've been playing with orchestral and acoustic elements, that I feel I consider the two one orchestration, so to speak. There is no, I'll look at a synth part and I'll say, well, that's doing the French horn part, so I don't need to French horns there. So there
okay.
is a more healthy arrangement happening from the beginning, versus what happens traditionally a lot of the times is that you have synths going and then you have orchestra going, and you try to put the two together and they kind of crash into one another. Whereas that's something perhaps that I honed in for sure with Daft Punk, watching them work and watching how we worked. I mean, that was certainly their goal too, is to incorporate the orchestra and electronics. In fact, I remember when we were doing the mock-ups, we had two like VCA faders. One was for the electronics and one was for the orchestra.
Hmm.
And one story I've told before, which is really, none of this was really I could even say at the time because I couldn't put words to these thoughts.
Yeah.
Luckily, in hindsight, I could talk about it like this. But when we were doing the mix, there was one cue which Thomas, one of the robots, he said he said, "Hey, we want to try this cue just with orchestra alone. Please mute the electronics." And we listened back and the orchestra sounded really thin and underwhelming, and I was really disappointed in myself. I said, here I am, I'm supposed to be the orchestra guy, and the orchestra just doesn't sound that good. And then, Thomas sat back and said, okay, mute the orchestra, let's just listen to the electronics. And same thing, the electronics sounded like just underwhelming and not interesting enough and kind of thin. And then, Thomas said, okay, let's listen to everything together again. And it sounded perfect, and
Sure.
that to me is kind of the summary of why that collaboration worked really well, and why what you said, George, which is, hey, you have this really cool taste in electronics. I think it's less about, oh, I have the magical synthesizers or something, because I don't. I have what everyone else has. I have some really cool synths in a room at my studio that I wish I had more time to use. I have so many amazing hardware synths, and I rarely get to use them because our deadlines are so
Deadlines.
fast.
Yeah,
I
of
can't
course.
just sit there and play with one patch for 2 days, which I believe me, I'd love to do. But but uh, but we I have the same tools as everyone else. Everyone else, I think it's just the way I think and the way I approach it, and the little decisions I make that allows me to get to, I don't know, whatever makes me me.
Yeah, that's a cool way of saying it. To actually approach synthesizers as part of the orchestra, which is, I would say, obviously the world is changing, but still, a lot of people, especially in the classical scene, they would regard synthesizers as something not as advanced as orchestra, the orchestra, which is, it's just a cover. It's a tool that we use to convey emotions. So,
Absolutely.
which one is your favorite synth, both analog and synth?
Oh no, it's and it goes into what I was saying earlier. It's all one sound to me. I think that is one
Mm,
disappointment I have. I go to see John Williams concerts and whatever, Harry Potter live, and like all these concerts that we have now, which are so great, and it's so wonderful to see that magic happening
yeah,
live, to picture and see the musicians playing, and it's a big money making thing. It's funny, when I was studying music in New York, the general attitude there, kind of like you hinted at earlier, was like looking down at film music, looking down at what we did. And now the New York Philharmonic plays scores live to picture, like and they make a lot of money doing it, and
yeah,
it's, to them, it's a money making thing. But I think for me, one of the bummer things I have is my scores, the electronics are so integral, and it's really hard to do that live, because there's such a, because two things. One is you need to have the electronic tools present, I think, to have something be really powerful. Like, I want to see people playing the instruments, but so much of electronics we consider, pre-records, as we call
yeah,
them,
yeah,
pre-recorded. So I think it's really weird that you have a full orchestra on stage and you just have this whole bed of electronics playing, with no visual element. And then it's also a big technological challenge. If you want to play it live, are you sending MIDI clock everywhere? I mean, we're obviously getting way into the weeds here, but like, so many of the synth elements are tempo synced.
yeah,
So, one of the coolest things about watching John Williams live, whether it's him conducting or David Newman, is they're just using streamers and pops, the old fashioned way. There's no click track.
yeah,
So my music needs a click track, which, first of all, a lot of orchestras are hesitant to even use a click track. And then even if you do, they may not know how to work with it too well, or they might say, oh, just the principals will have click, and not the rest of the
yeah,
players. And I understand technologically it's very challenging to get clicks and headphones to 80 musicians, but then, even then, are the musicians hearing the electronic component and playing to it? Usually not. They're just playing a click. So it just becomes very, I hope to do it one day. I'd love to work with an orchestra live, and I've done it before plenty of times, don't get me wrong, in concert. It's just not as elegant as, say, here's a John Williams score live, like
Yeah,
that
yeah,
one. And I talk about all the time how I'm jealous of, 50 years ago, John Williams, you show up to record the session, you lift your baton, you rehearse the music, Sean Murphy's in the booth mixing it to tape, and after the session's done, he goes on vacation. Like
yeah, yeah.
it's
That's
done,
right. Yeah,
and
no changes. Yeah,
no, and here, well, and if they are changes, if you look, it's funny. You look at the old soundtracks and you see the recording. Okay, they recorded 1 week in May, and then recorded 2 days in June, and then they recorded another day in August or something. And you see that they were just going back to do the fixes, to do changes. Like, oh, we had to rechange this in the cut, so they added that. Now, I go record the orchestra and I come back and the whole ending to the movie has changed. And so we're really tied into what they do in the edit. And so we record everything separately and it's in blocks and everything's stemmed out. And I'm sure you've gone over this in other podcasts, so I don't need to go over it
yeah,
too much, but it's just basically the idea that I'm not done after the recording
yeah,
session.
yeah,
I'm jealous of that. It's just mixed together. And that's a side effect of how I write too. If I didn't write with so many synthesizers and electronics, if that wasn't something that I was passionate about, then I could just record an orchestra and be done. But that's just not how it
yeah.
works.
Yeah, but nowadays, I mean, nowadays, synths and sound design is kind of intervened with acoustic music. So uh, anyway, you need to, with some obviously some exceptions, but most of the time you need to not only compose but also create and scope the sounds from even before the project has happened. Um, how would you mentioned before, playing to live, the concept of the live music, and bringing something new to the concert scene, to the stage. And I actually meant to ask you this a bit later, but now the conversation has gone into that direction. So, can you tell us more about the Echo Society?
Oh, yes, sure. I think that is at the most basic level, that was a group of film composers. We were hanging out, watching a concert, and we just looked at each other and said, we could do this and we could do it better. and
Yeah,
and I think also it was from a desire to take more ownership over our art. I think we are, and don't get me wrong, I love what I do for my quote unquote day job,
yeah,
but my day job is I have to answer to producers and directors and studios, and if they're not happy, then I'm not, I can't be happy, So this was a way for us as a group of film composers slash media composers, however you want to, whatever label you want to apply to most of our whatever day jobs. It was a way for us to say, hey, we have really cool artistic taste as well, and we want to share that and develop, and in fact hone it in and develop. I think for me personally, to my detriment, I tell people all the time, stylistically, I'm a constant evolution. There are some composers that are very bullheaded about, I have a style, this is my style, this is what I do, and they're very successful because people come to them for that style. And I've just never been that way. I've always been someone who says my style is a constant evolution. I'm constantly
true.
exploring. And I think the Echo Society is another facet of that for a number of us in the Echo Society. We look at that as a playground for us to explore and to develop ideas that we could maybe even hone in later on a film. So I look at it as something really positive, not only for us individually, but for us collectively. I think that's the other important thing is I think historically, I feel like, in the 50s and 60s, or I guess more like the 40s and the 50s with the studio system in Hollywood, there was this camaraderie, or it sounds like there was, obviously. I wasn't there. But, if you hear someone like John Williams talk about working with Alfred Newman and Lionel Newman, and you hear what the studio system was like, that there was this band of composers working together, and they would talk to each other all the time. They would have lunch together, and they would all work together to score the slate of films for the studio. And I think over the years that evolved to composers kind of separately working in their own studios and almost having an animosity. I mean, I know it feels very passive aggressive sometimes that, some composers, don't get along. And I think this is our way of trying to return to some of that spirit
Mm.
of not with the studio system specifically, but just the idea that we are a community and we could help each other. So
Yeah.
I think that's another important part of the society that we as film composers and or just as musicians and composers in general, we call upon each other to help each other out and to ask for advice and to, whether it's doing a project, a deal, or royalties, or how to approach something creatively. There's just such a good spirit there that I think as we continue, as the business continues to evolve, we need that versus, just kind of more
Yeah.
bullheaded fighting each other or something.
I'm not 100% sure about what I'm going to say, but I have some sort of a distant memory that Ennio Morricone was actually part of a composer group of composers from their age, and they were also doing a lot of experiments. For example, playing a trumpet with a oboe mouthpiece.
Okay, that's
Yeah,
cool.
so stuff like this, and basically this is from that period actually came the idea of the baritone electric guitar with the orchestra and stuff. Yeah,
There's the what is it, the New York composers it was back in the, was it the 70s or the 80s? It was Michael Kamen formed it in New York. I think there was something like that. And one of the funny stories I know, and I'll say it here for posterity because nobody knows this. I had to it just so happened that I was really lucky that I got to work with Martin Bresnik, who is
mm,
a big professor at Yale now.
yeah,
He's one of the big composition teachers at Yale. I got to work with him a little bit, and I got to do a couple master classes with Mark Snow, best known for the X-Files, but obviously millions of other TV
yeah.
shows. Obviously, he's one of the biggest TV composers of all time. But the oboe section of Juilliard Pre-College was
I know this.
Mark
Yeah,
Snow, Martin Bresnik, and Michael Kamen. Those are the three oboe players at Juilliard Pre-College.
yeah,
And then I think it was it Michael Kamen and Mark Snow, or maybe it was just Michael Kamen. Some other ones formed like a contemporary composers group
yeah.
from there. So yeah, I thank you for telling me about the Ennio Morricone story. I didn't know this. I'm gonna go read about it.
Yeah,
That's
I'm
great.
I'm not 100% sure, but I have some sort of a memory about this.
Yeah.
Yeah. So going back to the Witcher series, that was a bit about the sound of the Witcher because you kind of inherit some sort of a musical style that was brought from the games, I suppose.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's interesting, right? Because Nikolai Stravinsky is an old friend of mine. Well, we've known
Really?
each other for
Okay.
years. Yeah. But he's such a great guy. And 15 years ago, we would be hanging out. We used to have talking about composer things. We used to have it was like a lads night out that one of our British buddies, that's why it's called lads night out. We don't use the word lad here in America, but where we'd all, a bunch of composers would get together and have some beers. And that's how I know Nikolai from a million years ago. We would all just hang out all the time. But yeah, so and it is interesting, right? I think to me, that sound is a way of connecting to the heritage of Poland, and
Mhm.
I think that's something that I'm disappointed that I didn't, because of COVID and the lockdowns. I was kind of left to my own devices to
Sure.
hey Joe, take this sound and run with it.
Yeah.
And I feel like I got there a little bit, but I see a hurdy-gurdy behind you.
It's not intentional. Yeah. Yeah.
I jokingly say that my memoir of working on The Witcher is going to be how I learned to love the hurdy-gurdy, because I do not love the hurdy-gurdy, but I need to love the hurdy-gurdy because
Yeah.
it's such a big part of the sound. But I think I'm excited to look. I can't say anything for sure right now on this podcast, but I think moving forward, I think next season, fingers crossed if they have me back, I think that's where my talking about sound, that's where my especially now that I could leave the house again, my
Yeah.
intention is to really dive more into that sound and try to find a way to honor Poland even more. Because I haven't been to Poland in years, and then that's something, again, I was super disappointed about, that I couldn't go to Poland
Sure.
for the first season of that I did of The Witcher, because I felt, it's necessary to work with musicians of that heritage, and also for some reason, George, actually, this is a great maybe something we need to talk about further. I think it's, we have a lot of great quote unquote ethnic libraries out there, but there are some Polish instruments missing. So,
Yeah, that's right.
so maybe you and I need to talk about that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm excited for that sound to continue to evolve. Netflix has a lot of Witcher, I think, ahead of them.
Yeah.
And because there's so many novels, I think what we have Witcher that, say, Marvel doesn't have, and nothing against Marvel, because those are the biggest movies around these days. But Marvel doesn't really have a unified sound other than orchestra.
That's
If
right.
you say,
Yeah,
what
yeah,
is the
that's right.
Marvel sound, you just say, okay, like super traditional
Mhm.
orchestra, which to me is very uninteresting.
Yeah.
I could sit down and write strings and brass and woodwinds all day long, but the thing that makes things truly interesting is that for The Witcher, I can't just write a string pad and a piano and be done. It needs a certain amount of intentional sound design, intentional instruments, intentional. And I think The Witcher, whether it's me or Mikolai or Sonia or whoever else might be involved with the project, there is a unifying
Yeah.
sound that comes from the heritage of Poland, which is amazing. It's amazing to me, and I
Yeah.
just I'm very grateful to be asked to be involved, because I've learned so much doing that.
Yeah, and it's from my perspective as a viewer and as a listener, I really dislike when you have some sort, especially in the fantasy genre. So when you establish a certain sound and a certain aesthetic, when you do something that's out of what you've established before. I'll give you just one example. I don't want to say anything bad about Game of Thrones, but I was really I just disliked the idea of having like for example a solo piano with strings on a scene where you have a score that's mostly, you have a lot of ethnic elements, and you have the solo cello, obviously you have the guitar VO and stuff, and then you go in a direction that's like Ludovico Einaudi or something. That's yeah.
Well, one thing I'll what's great about what we do is I've years ago I'd be like, oh, what is that composer doing? And then I've learned the hard way that there's some battles the composer loses. So
Oh yeah, yeah,
that
of
could be
course,
that
of
could be
course.
an instance of they
Yeah.
put in some Ludovico Einaudi
No,
in the
yeah,
temp, and the producer's like, Ramin, you have to do this,
yeah,
So
yeah.
so I'll give Ramin the benefit of the doubt there. But you're right. I think probably he'd agree with you. Ramin would probably agree with you. Like, yeah, I didn't want to
Yeah.
use piano, but I was told I need to use piano, and sometimes you lose those battles. I'm sure he pushed back, but
Yeah.
you're exactly right. I think that's one of the fun things about our job is that like you were saying earlier, George, before we hit record, you were scoring a movie, and this mountaineer is in the mountains. So you say, okay, what sounds can I use to evoke that feeling? And you went out and bought Tibetan bells. I hope I'm getting that story right.
Yeah, yeah,
But
that's
that's
right.
exactly that's super fun that we get to almost be an extension of the picture. I think that's one of the amazing things that I guess that just separates what we do versus, I don't know. I obviously doesn't separate us from concert music, because obviously you have programmatic concert music from a million years ago. But the idea that we are an extension of this story that's greater than us, and then ultimately, if we do the job right, we become frozen in time with this piece of art.
Yeah.
That and the score is a truly an extension of it. I think if I was to point to something that I'm most proud of, kind of going back to what we were talking about, style and arrangement and that sort of thing, one thing I'm really proud of is that for some of the projects I've worked on, I've been able to really, and again, I think this might come from Daft Punk, working with Daft Punk and seeing how they did it for
Mhm.
Tron. But they were really trying to create something timeless. And that was something I think I took with me for every project I do. I'm trying to create something so weaved into that project, so integral to the sound of that story, that it's not my score any longer. It is the score for that film, that it
Yeah.
belongs less to me and it belongs more to everyone. And I think that's something that I'm not comparing myself to Hans at all. Please don't confuse
Hmm.
that. But I think one thing Hans does really well that I like to think about a lot is how he makes things, these really big ideas that he has, sound effortless. Like, like if you listen to, obviously the greatest example probably is Time. You listen to Time and you think like that is so effortless. It
Yeah.
had to be written for Inception, had to be written for that scene. And you and I know as composers, that's so difficult to come up with a device that is so simple, that is so evocative and straightforward and feels like it always existed. I think it's kind of I think Beethoven was a great, if we're going to go
Mm.
classical, is a
Yeah.
great example of a composer who was able to boil something down to the most simplest element and then spin it out into something that feels massive yet also very intimate. And I think that is something that, I don't know, one day I hope to have more
Mm.
opportunities to be able to create something like that. We'll see.
I actually had a remark from a audio director that I'm working with right now. It's about a main title theme, so obviously a lot of revisions. So maybe 5 or 6 different versions of it, and we're almost there. What he told me was like, don't try to introduce new elements to it. Just look at what Beethoven did at the Fifth Symphony. So just you have a nice theme, you have a nice melody. So just work around it. And but going back to what you said about Game of Thrones, there are some people that still don't understand the nature of this business, but they're less and less, I would say. So nowadays, you have to be like essentially at the end of the day, you're providing emotional device to help convey the message of the film. So this is a bit of a philosophical question. So from the point of you as a composer, how do you create art when you have the clock ticking and producers, directors, a bunch of other people who are not musicians also take some sort of a decision about the music?
Well, I think the first artistic decision you make as a composer is, what limitations are you going to have? I think that's really important. For instance, like Stravinsky talks about, when he was writing a melody, he would limit himself to one octave. He would just look at that one octave and just say the melody is going to be here. So that is one limitation. I think for something like, let me see if I can give an example of something recent. I'll think of something in a minute, but I think that's number one. You have to come up with limitations, because as a composer, everything is so available to us. We have all, I'm looking at my sample library drive. I have 15 terabytes of sounds.
Yeah.
And on one hand, if I can't make the most amazing film score of all time with 1 terabyte of samples, I should be fired immediately. So the fact that there's 15 terabytes of sample libraries, is that in and of itself is just goes to show how rich we are of sound. Yet that doesn't define the quality of what we do.
That's right.
What the quality of what we do is, like you said, George, hey, I have these 3 notes, how do I spin these out? So I think that's number one, is to limit your palette. I think what that also does too, it allows you to connect directly with an audience. One thing that I find very dangerous about film music is it's very easy to do all this stuff, to put a lot of notes into the computer, to have 100 tracks of stuff, and to just be a wash of sound, like a neutral, like strings, brass, piano, whatever. Okay, it's just a neutral wash. Whereas, some of the best cues I've been a part of, or I've seen, or I've written, have been 8 tracks, or 4 tracks, of material that there's one sound, one pad. We make a lot out of like, oh my God, how many tracks are in your template?
Yeah.
And that is like the wrong question. It's like, what one sound gets that character? What one element do you help the audience understand that character? So I think one is, making limits. Two is exactly that. Like, what lens are you looking through? Like, are you approaching this through the viewpoint of that character or that group of characters, or are we viewing this as an audience? So I think you want to be asking the right questions to get to the point where you make those stylistic decisions that inform the type of score and the type of music you're going to write. Okay, so I'll have an example for you. So Spiderhead, this film that I just wrapped up recently, Joe Kosinski film, actually the director of Tron. And it's about a scientist who like experiments on these prisoners, and he's like experimenting with their emotions, like controlling their emotions with drugs, like making people fall in love. And so the analogy I had for that, I said, I really want to hear voices. You know, that was a very early conversation with me and Joe, the director. We agreed we want to hear choirs and voices, but it becomes an analogy for the control that this scientist has over his subjects, that these voices are like super precise, like very quantized and very, very almost synthetic because they are being manipulated. So I think it's less about saying, you know, oh, what's successful or what works, what doesn't work, because oftentimes I'll have these thoughts like, let me try to think of an example. Like I was doing a film where I said, oh, the main character is former CIA operative, so the music is going to be like have these militaristic type of, and that didn't work at all. But that sort of rule, that first entry point, and that's how I talk about what is your point of entry into this world. Like it's important to have a point of entry into something so that at least you're making progress forward. So, you know, for Spiderhead, for instance, you know, if I had done those vocals and it didn't work, then that's fine. It's fine if something doesn't work. In fact, that's why I like starting as early as possible, so I have plenty of room to fall on my face and fail. But it's through that failure that we ultimately get to a point that hopefully is embedded and embedded in the film. And when I talk to young composers, I oftentimes say like it's up to us to convince the filmmakers that this is their score, to make them feel involved, because inevitably what happens, and now we're getting into the political aspect of filmmaking,
Of course,
is,
yeah.
you know, that producers or studios or whoever will say, oh, we don't like the music. And if you haven't invested in your filmmaker by, you know, working with your filmmaker to get them to love the score and to get them to feel that this score is their vision as well, then what starts to happen is, you know, then the filmmaker goes, oh yeah, okay, I'm not sure if I like the music either, you know. Whereas if you've hopefully gotten the filmmaker, and whether it's the filmmaker and the producers or whoever, if you've gotten people invested in your work and invested in the sound you've created for a picture, when the studio says we don't like it, then you're going to have a filmmaker standing up for you.
Yeah.
And I believe me, I've been on both sides of this. You know, it's inevitable as a composer that you get fired. That is certainly a rite of passage. I was fired a couple months ago off a project, and that's just the way it works. That's the way the business is. But you know, the goal is to not get fired.
Yeah, that's
and hopefully, if you're able to get the filmmaker, you know, and in fact, the story I have for firing is the filmmaker was super invested in the score. The filmmaker was like, this is my score. This is the most amazing score ever. But unfortunately, that filmmaker didn't have the power to fight. And the big producer said, I don't like your taste. I don't like your music. I don't like your editing, and fired me and the editor at once. And so that, you know, that's a little side story of no matter how hard you work, you're going to get fired, and you're going to get fired at any point in your career, whether you have 1 credit or 1,000 credits. You know, if you look at my IMDb, I have all these credits, I've done all this stuff, and I still get fired. But I think, anyway, back to the original point of the conversation, I think my goal anyway, and this is what works for me aesthetically, is to limit my palette, find some entry points, and try to come up with some rules that allow me to at least start. Because like I said, if you have 15 terabytes of samples and you have a 90-piece orchestra and you have, you know, an artist you want to collaborate with, this and this and this, it's very easy to just get lost and not have any entry point, and just kind of get lost in just not understanding what you're trying to do, versus saying, I'm going to do one thing. I want to, like I said with Spiderhead, I hear a vocal. For me, it was vocal. I heard voices and bass clarinets, and I said, okay, that's what we're doing. So when you hear the final score, I'm really excited to share it later this year. I'm not actually sure when it comes out, but I think it's really unique sound, because not only is it a unique film, but I found a way to collaborate with the director and to illustrate elements of the story in the score. So that's really fun when I get to do that. It is really, and kind of like what we did on The Machine,
Yeah,
which I don't know when that movie's going to come out. I sure hope it comes out soon. Obviously, anything with Russian overtones these days gets very political very quickly.
sure.
But that score, it's interesting because we were going for this big action movie sound, but it's a comedy, and so there's a certain amount of traditionalism with which you, George, because we did the orchestra
Yeah,
and choir with you in Bulgaria, you saw more of the traditional side of things, whereas there were a lot of cues that we didn't do there that were more electronic, more contemporary, quote unquote. But yeah, maybe we could talk about that score when that film comes out.
yeah, I would love to, and I'm actually really excited because that was a nice combination of some of our choral heritage combined with Russian and obviously your music. Yeah, and when you're saying this, it's whether it's this movie, which was also, the music was in a way connected to the drama, to the storyline. It's important nowadays that you understand the process of filmmaking. What you said is very important to make ally. This is very political when I say it like this, but yeah, at the end, I suppose it's the same. I've never been into a situation where, like, a director would probably speak to the DP, for example, and discuss colors and lighting and lenses or whatever. But I suppose it's kind of the same as when certain directors talk with the composer about sounds, about emotion, about colors. I've worked with directors who basically don't care about the music, which is
Well, this is a
yeah,
great subject
yeah,
actually because the greatest piece of advice I got when I moved to LA is a composer said to me, "Joe, you are no longer in the music business. You are in the film business. It is your job to understand how the film business works." Now, I want to put a little caveat to this. There are so many giant composers now that let's say the Trent Reznors, the Johnny Greenwoods, and I'm so angry that we lost him, but someone like Johan Johansson,
yeah,
where they are outside of that world, where they are kind of like an auteur film composer, where they have their music career so set that filmmakers come to them and ask them to please give them this sound. So this doesn't really apply to them in a way. Like so maybe if someone's listening to this and you want to be that, well, just go be that. But for the rest of us, myself included, who say, I want to make my living writing film music on a daily basis. This is what I love doing. You really are part of a team, and it is up to you. And it's interesting, George, because you mentioned DPs. I think in general, filmmakers know a lot more about lensing and lighting and what that cinematographer is doing than what we are doing as
yeah. That's
composers.
right. Yeah, that's right.
And it's a fact that music is such an intangible, subjective thing. Something to me that's a very happy piece of music to you might be a really sad piece of music, and that's just how that's art. Art is very subjective. Music is perhaps the most subjective art because it crosses so many language boundaries, and it's so immediate to so many people based on your connection to music. But that makes it super hard for filmmakers to work with us, which is why, kind of what I was saying earlier, the whole reason that I put so much thought into approaching a film is because I want to find common ground to connect with that filmmaker. Like I wouldn't go to a filmmaker and say, "Oh, I want to use these types of vocals. Like I want to use baritone singing this in the key of D sharp and this," because the filmmaker is going to have no idea. But if I say to the filmmaker, "Oh, I want to hear vocals that are very controlled and very precise because that is an analogy to how this character is controlling the protagonist of the film," then we're now on a level that we could talk to each other.
Sure.
And the hardest, I have to say, the worst projects I've been a part of, or not the worst, I'm trying to think of what's the right way to put this. The most difficult projects I've
Project.
been a part of is when the director cannot make a decision. And that's what you'll hear. The director's job number one as a filmmaker is to not necessarily know what they want, but make a decision. Obviously, ideally, they know what they want and they help inform you how to get it, and they collaborate with
Yeah.
you on how to achieve it. That is number one. But if they don't know what they want, hopefully they could have a conversation and you could start presenting ideas and they could start giving you feedback on those ideas.
Yeah.
And that's why I like starting early, because it's very hard for a director to know what they want musically without, God forbid, referencing other music. That's why we deal with temps so
Sure.
often,
Yeah.
because it's a frame of reference for the filmmaker to say, yes, I want music like that. They can just point at that cake in the window and say, bake me a cake like that. And you
Yeah.
say,
Yeah.
okay, I'm gonna go bake you the, you know, the Dark Knight cake. Thank you. Thank you for temping your
Yeah.
movie with the Dark Knight. I hate you. You know, but you know, the hardest projects I've been a part of is when you do that and the director still is like, oh, I'm not sure. Oh, is that right? Or oh, constantly questioning. And I've heard stories about those are the worst sets too, is when, you know, the DP has lit something and say, okay, it's lit like this because I'm emphasizing the character's dark side. So you see the shadows here and you see this, and they're just, oh, I don't know. Are you sure we're getting this? You know, it's like, and it's okay to be clear. It's okay to say, I don't know. But sometimes I've worked on projects where there's just this constant, I don't know.
Yeah.
And that's like, I like to talk about either being a chef or an athlete or something. You know, if you're an offensive lineman and you're blocking the quarterback from all the defenders coming and your quarterback is running around not knowing what they're doing, it becomes very hard to do your job. And I feel like in some ways that's like a film composer trying to score a movie where the director doesn't know what they want. So I preemptively try to start music conversations really early to prevent that, to allow the director to have plenty of time to understand what music can and can't do, and how we could work together to deliver something that is unique to their film. So it's like, that's how I try to do things, where it gets the job done, but it's still artful.
Yeah.
But sometimes art goes out the window and you just have to deliver with the temp, and
Oh
just the way
yeah,
it is.
of course. Yeah. Unfortunately for us, because sometimes I've been in situations where I know that that's not a good decision for the film, not from the point of view of a composer, ego-driven musician or something, but just for the sake of the film, that's not a good idea. And sometimes it just happens like this. That's also the nature of the.
I say that a lot to young composers. It's important that we as composers have points of view. Anyone in LA can score a movie. I think, if you look down the street, everyone has garage band, everyone's playing with music, anyone can score a film. And I think that's great. I think it's very democratic. Anyone with a voice can share that voice, but you want to get hired, not the guy down the street. So you're being hired for your point of view, not just that you could execute the job. Because again, anyone can execute the job out here. It's an amazing town full of talented people. So how do you get hired on something? It's by providing a point of view and having projects and having other people say, wow, Joe has a point of view and he has an interesting approach to things. And I loved my conversations with him talking about the score. And then he actually delivered a score that delivered on that point of view, that made me happy, that I feel is our score, that is my score for the movie. That's what you want filmmakers saying about you.
So, speaking about this, and going back to The Witcher, but maybe it's not. Let's talk about Shadow and Bone. Let's talk about Shadow and Bone.
We can talk about any of those.
Yeah. So basically, you have a series which has a certain style, aesthetic, and so forth. But you're not working on this throughout the entire year, correct? So you're working for just...
let me think. Shadow and Bone, I worked about 8 months on
8 months.
Shadow and Bone,
okay.
And Witcher was even longer. Maybe this is a weakness of mine, but like I said, I love starting early. And it makes things hard because I have projects finishing and I have projects starting. So my brain is always moving from finishing one, starting another. But I find that, that like starting early allows me to get embedded with the characters in a way that if I just came in and scored episode 1, that's a disservice. I think if I just said, okay, I'm going to score episode 1 and figure it out as I go, I'm trying to be aware of a character's journey.
Sure.
So that I am writing music from a perspective that is really their internal perspective, that when I write for this character, I'm delivering on their emotional desires, on what they want, on what they truly feel, maybe even something that I know where their character goes in 8 episodes. So that's influencing the decision I make here when I write their theme.
Hmm.
And maybe the character doesn't even understand it at that point in the
Yeah, yeah,
series, but the music is part of their journey. And I know, I mean, I know some of this, can sound like absolute garbage, like ridiculous. Like, what is Joe talking about? This is ridiculous. But, and sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes I say, oh, I'm going to design this music for this character and let's do this, this, and this, and this. But I do truly believe that even if I'm successful 1 out of 10 times, that one time that I'm successful is going to be so successful where the music is going to be such an integral part of that character's journey that the audience is going to walk away better for it, that they're going to
true.
feel so much more compelled by understanding where that
Mm.
character is going. And in fact, that's how I approach both Shadow and Bone and The Witcher is going, where are these characters going? What drives them? What are their needs and desires? And, where are they at this moment in time versus where are they in 3 episodes? And how do I help get them there? How do I help propel them there musically? And again, sometimes, you just look at the schedule and you look at the clock and you look at your rent and you go, okay, I just need to get this cue done. But because I started early, because I already had these big thoughts earlier, hopefully when the clock is ticking and I need to rewrite a cue and things are crazy, I'm just reverting back to this state of just, I still have this understanding of this character and I'm just going to write some music now. And that's going to that's going to subconsciously drive me there versus just running around
Yeah.
with no direction.
And what happens if like certain projects overlap more than they should actually?
Oh
So
gosh. Yeah, I had a filmmaker ask me recently, "Oh, do you try to do one project at a time?" And or not do you try? He said, "Do you do one project at a time?" And that was my response. I said, "I try." When I look
yeah,
at my schedule and I talk with my agent and I'm talking with producers, I try to line things up so when one film ends, one film begins or another film begins. And the problem with that is in post-production is where the magic happens, right? Oh,
yeah,
that character's not working. Oh, well, let's recut it. Let's shoot an additional scene. Let's do this. So inevitably, the film that's ending says, oh, we're actually going to end in 6 months instead. We're going to push. And so you have this project starting here and you go, well, what am I going to do now? And you just have no choice but to do them both,
yeah,
and
yeah,
the filmmaker of the projects that's pushing is gonna go, what do you mean you're doing this other film? Screw you, my film is the biggest film ever, like you're
yeah,
but and that, I have to say, that is one of the interesting things about where we are in terms of post-production, digital post-production, where post can just go forever and ever, as well as fees. If composer fees had risen with inflation over the last 30 years, we'd be getting paid so much now that maybe we don't need to be having these projects overlap. Maybe
yeah,
we say, okay, yeah, this film. I mean, the other thing that's difficult as composers, you say, okay, I'm going to do this movie for 6 months and I'm going to do it for this amount of money. And then they go, oh, our schedule's pushing. It's now going to last a year. And you say, well, we don't get paid more. We don't get
yeah,
paid $1 more for that 6 month push. So you go, okay, this money I was going to get for 6 months, now I get the same amount of money for 12 months. And so it's interesting. I'm very transparent. If you look at my IMDb and you look at my projects, you'll see my team listed, and that really is the only way. And every bit of that is honest. All those people you see who are in my music
yeah,
department, they're incredibly talented people who help me when this happens, so that they allow me to focus on those high concept thoughts so that I could go, what is the Darkling's desires? What are Geralt's desires? What
yeah,
are, in Spiderhead, what are this character's desires? That I could execute and create music for that character. But then when the schedule gets crazy and we're getting new versions of picture and we have to conform the cues to the new versions of the picture, and someone says we don't like something, can you help rewrite something? That I have a team of people around me that handles under my direction, obviously, and it's a very collaborative process. No, they're not just rescoring a film without my input, but they are
yeah,
there to help me get the job done, period. And I
mm,
think it's very interesting because I speak to some filmmakers and they're like, oh, that's insane. How dare you have other people help? And I speak to other filmmakers and say, oh, that's great that you have a team, like that can help you, because a lot of composers get fired because they don't have a team, because
yeah,
they don't have people around them to help keep up with the deadlines and help keep up with the revisions and the notes and the desires of the producers. And so that is something that I think it's important for everyone out there, even if you are just starting out as a film composer, to be aware that comes a point where it's going to be real important for you to be able to have someone by your side. Just that one person,
Yeah.
just that one person you say, oh my God, I need to rewrite the whole movie. Like help me write these few scenes based on this theme. It's very important to have that team around you, because otherwise you're never going to get it done. At least it with the deadlines we have in Hollywood,
Yeah.
it's just the nature of life.
Well, it kind of is the same here in Bulgaria. I mean, obviously it's nowhere near Hollywood, but
No, but it's the same. No, that's
yeah.
fine.
But at the end, you get again not a very big payment here in Bulgaria. Everything is in like package deals, so you have to also negotiate something and be very careful of what you decide as a composer, because yeah, obviously I love Lord of the Rings, but for chamber drama, I probably that's not the best idea of an ensemble size. But
Exactly. And that, I have to say that's the hard part that we don't talk about. I wish there was more business classes for young composers. I wish I had business classes, because
yeah,
that is absolutely right. If you're not careful, you start to lose money by being a film composer, because you say,
yeah,
okay, I'll do it for this much money, and the schedule pushes, and then all of a sudden you realize, oh my god, I want to hire an 80-piece orchestra. Wait, how much does that cost? Like,
yeah,
so, you really have to be. It is such a brutal job. I have to say, at times I go, why do I do this job? Because you not only are creatively driven, but you're running a business that has to earn enough money for you to survive. But you're also trying to deliver on a package deal with an
yeah,
orchestra. It just becomes very odd very quickly. And so the more educated you are about how business works and how psychology works and how to connect with people, the better you are. I say that a lot when I used to teach at UCLA. I would say to students all the time, I was like, you need to be a people person. Like, you need to be really
yeah,
good at working with others, because you can't do this. Again, like I said, if you want to be the outside composer that people go to, that's great, but it's going to be very hard to succeed, because for every Trent Reznor, there's, I think, 5,000 other
yeah.
wonderful, amazing artists sitting, making albums, who aren't going to get the same call that Trent Reznor got. So I think if you really want to be a film composer, if you really are like, hey, I got to do this, you have to be what I'm talking about, which is that people person, that kind of driven, I'm going to do this for a living type of person.
Yeah, and it gives a lot back, because it's at the end we get to make music what we love. On the other hand, yeah, it's very important. I think maybe the hardest part about, if someone asked me 15 years ago what a film composer does, I would say, well, a film composer writes music for film. That's it. But
Wouldn't that be great?
yeah,
I would love that.
exactly. Yeah. But nowadays, if someone asked me today, I would say a film composer is maybe a person who would work. I'll speak from my personal perspective. So I'm working on this year I've been working on a video game that got pushed back, and which is aesthetically in a very specific place. I can't say more, but it's a very, very specific, harmonically, melodically, instrumentation wise, and everything. It's very, very specific. So really hard to come by with any means, that are any tools that are at our disposal nowadays. On the other hand, I have this children's movie, which is a completely different thing. So it's more of a Lydian mode, joyful music, and so forth. And in between, I have to deal with the economic side of both of those projects and handle the team that I have, and still keep up with someone telling me this music doesn't work, which normally from an artist's perspective, I would say, this guy doesn't like me, doesn't like the music I do. So you have to be like a psychologist, you have to write music, you have to be an economist in a certain sense,
Business
and
person,
still,
yeah.
keep a sane mind about what you're doing.
And that's another reason. Again, it goes back to that idea of creating rules. That's another reason why having that viewpoint,
Yeah,
I think, is so necessary, because when you have the possibility to write any music, any music, any sound is on your hard drive, and you're dealing with all this noise of like, oh, we don't like this, we don't like that. It's so important that when you close the door and it's time to write music, that you can start writing, that you have a clear viewpoint, that you have these rules you've established that allow you to accomplish the task at hand. Versus, that was one of the most difficult things about writing concert music back when I wrote a lot more concert music, is you go, what do I actually write? Why am I writing music?
Yes.
Why,
Yes.
symphony number one.
Yeah.
Well, what the heck is this symphony about? So I think that is, it's what we're talking about is two sides of the same thing. One, how wonderful it is, George, that people are saying, George, I don't like it. Can you write more music? Like, how awesome is it that people are like, George, please write music. Joe, please write music. That we have people paying us to write music. But the flip side is actually, my friend said it much more elegantly. He said, we don't get paid to write music. We get paid to deal with the notes. We get paid to deal with the revisions. We get paid to deal with the politics. And that's the way I look at it, because I truly believe that, hey, if I didn't have a job, if you said, Joe, here's $10 million, you're done, you could do whatever you want, I'd say, great. I'd still write music just because that's who I am. I'd still make music. So the way I look at it is, Warner Brothers or Disney or Netflix or whoever, they're paying me not to write music. They're paying me to write and deliver to their specifications. And it's a real achievement when I can make their specifications also my artistic desires. Like, that is the goal, right? Like we were saying earlier, like, how do you rectify the two? Well, it is a great achievement for something like Shadow and Bone or Witcher when I get to sit at the end of the day and say, wow, like, I delivered what they wanted and I'm really proud of it. That's cool, because I'll be the first one to say I've delivered projects that I'm not proud of, because I say, okay, well, I delivered what they wanted, but I'm really disappointed. I wasn't able to achieve something that I wanted. And don't get me wrong, that's what I try to do for every project. I try to achieve something artistically that I'm proud of, but it's not the volume and the deadlines and the nature of our job doesn't allow us to.
Sometimes it's not possible.
Hit a home run every time. It's not possible.
And I remember one video of that thing. It was the Creative Crips by Spitfire. When they
it's embarrassing. I think I'm wearing this sweater in that,
video.
Now that I'm looking at this. So it's that video, and I'm wearing this sweater.
Well, no worries. We're just recording audio.
Oh, good. It's audio only. Good. Yeah, that's embarrassing. I'm a composer, not a fashionist.
Yeah. But so you mentioned that you have the a replica of your studio back at home, so you can write from home. How do you do this? I cannot write from a.
So it's funny. I actually moved about a year ago. So now at home, I only have like a laptop just with. I do have my sample library here. I have like just kind of a light version of my studio, so I could open some sessions. So I no longer have that. At my new place, I'll probably build something eventually, but the only way it works is it's, in LA, since we have yards. Generally, if you buy a house in LA, you have a little yard and you usually have like a little garage. It's in a separate building. So you walk out and you get out of the house. So was your question more about that, or did you want to know technologically how that works?
No, not technologically. More like keeping, family and work.
Yeah. I now that I'm married, now that family is a thing, I don't have a studio at home. I have a spare room that I use as my office. And like I said, I'm looking at a MIDI keyboard and like some faders and a sample drive. So I can open a certain amount of sessions at home if I need to do something quickly. I have most of my plugins on an iLock here. The most expensive thing of what we do is the iLock.
Yes.
But the majority of my work now is out of the house, which it's lovely to be able to leave the house and then come home and leave the studio at home. So I think a lot of film composers, from what I hear around town, that's something very common, that film composers they have the office, but then they have like a little work area at home, so they don't have to, because our job is so around the clock and deadlines are crazy. It's nice to be able to say, okay, I worked at the studio 8 hours today and I get home, I have dinner with my family, but there's still work to do, but don't need to drive to the studio. I could like do some work at home. And so the Creative Cribs, that's a little outdated. In fact, I've remodeled that whole studio we were in. So maybe we'll have to do a sequel to that when you come to LA, George. So we can do a sequel.
Yeah, I would love to, now that things are more open. So just as a last question, if I may,
Please
what
do.
would be your suggestion from an orchestration point of view? I've really, yeah, I would say admired in a way some of your orchestration ideas when we recorded here, especially when it comes to brass, because brass it's a one tricky pony, and
Well, I'll tell you the trick of the brass is be a brass player. I used to play trombone,
really
so
okay, that
yeah, and
makes sense,
yeah,
perfect
and
sense.
I think one. There's a great story of Leonard Bernstein was at not Colburn Curtis as a student. So and there was four conductors there, and I forget who the teacher was, probably Stokowski or someone who was at
Mm.
the Philadelphia Orchestra or something. And he asked the conductors, "What do you play?" And all the conductors were pianists. And he goes, "What? You've never played in an orchestra?" So the story goes he kicked out the percussion from the orchestra at the school and he made his conducting students play the percussion. So at least they were sitting in the orchestra. And I think that is a really great piece of advice for composers. If you don't play an orchestral instrument, that's fine. But if you go to a school, go to the open rehearsals and sit in the audience or sit in the orchestra if you can
If
and
possible,
hear
yeah.
these instruments around you. That is something that I am so grateful for. I always played trombone. I don't play trombone anymore, but when I was a student, I played in Carnegie Hall. I played in the New Jersey Performing Arts Center. I played all over New York City and New Jersey. And I would, as a trombonist, you sit there for like 500 bars, waiting for
But
to play three notes, yeah, exactly, one
yeah.
staccato thing. So what did I do? We'd be playing Bartok Concerto for Orchestra, and the bass tribe played bass trombone. You have four notes in that whole damn piece. So I had the score next to me, and so I'm just looking at the score, listening to everything around me, and I was, oh, why does that sound like that? Oh, so there's orchestration 101, which is what are the ranges of the instruments,
Yeah,
but I feel like advanced orchestration is how do the instruments work together to achieve a sound, and in what register do they, not in what register, but how do they sound throughout their register, and how do you use them properly to achieve the sound you want? So that is the biggest thing I see when I look at a score as an orchestrator is I'm trying to make sure the instruments are in a register to achieve. I actually had this conversation last week because I worked with a young orchestrator recently, and to be clear, I miss orchestrating. Spiderhead, I orchestrated every note, so
mm.
I'm so proud when I get to or actually still orchestrate.
Yeah,
But so many times deadlines, I can't orchestrate any longer, just deadlines. But I was telling this orchestrator that the most important thing is that you listen to the demo. And for me anyway, I know there's some film composers out there who say, "Oh, you just have to orchestrate my MIDI," which I think is really stupid because the MIDI doesn't represent
that's right.
proper
Yeah,
orchestration.
that's right.
Proper orchestration is, yes, the MIDI is there, you have a guide, but proper orchestration, you hear the demo and you say, what is this composer trying to achieve? And then you might alter the voicings and alter the notes so that the composer can achieve what they're trying to achieve in the demo. So, one of the biggest mistakes I see in orchestrations is an instrument will be in a register where you can't hear them or they're not really contributing to the texture. And if you just put them an octave up or put them in a different place or wrote something differently, you would actually achieve something really cool. So I think that is where, yeah, that is the art of orchestration. That's a whole other conversation.
That
But
that's
yeah,
right. Yeah, but I
yeah,
think if you allow me to say this, when we,
please,
yeah,
please.
when we worked on your music, one of the things that really caught my eye just by when I was conducting it was that there these are very tiny and subtle details that make a huge difference when you have something like the third French horn doubling the trombone, because nowadays you have sample libraries, and then you have like 12 French horns or 24 or
And
68
then you
French
write
horns.
8 notes. And so you have,
Yeah.
now you have, 80, 96 horns
Yeah.
playing a, 4 note
and,
chord or so,
and still
whatever.
that was like on number of cues something that produced a very thick brassy sound without any struggle from the players. So that's very very clever
That is
in a way.
that is so key. where is it? I think I have it somewhere. I have the Adler orchestration book,
Yeah.
and I think that is one of, I still review it. I have sticky notes on the pages where, and what's so great is it has the recordings too. So, he shows you different voicing options and different doublings and how to achieve and what those voicings achieve. So you hear a recording of like how the sound changes with the different doubles. And I think that is, like you said, George, I think that is a great summary of what style is. When people say, "Oh, like I want to emulate that style," or "I want to emulate," it's not a simple thing, because style is all the little decisions that
Tiny
that person
decisions.
makes. Like if I say, "Okay, I need to sound like Michael Giacchino," or "I need to sound like Hans Zimmer," or "I need to sound like Trent Reznor," or whatever, I never could, because I don't have an understanding of the thousands upon thousands of minute decisions they are making every second to achieve what they're trying to do. And I think that's where orchestration, at least it's codified, that you can at least read about it, at least
Yeah.
hear it. But even then, like you said, George, those little decisions, they're so minute, but they make a huge difference in the sound. And that's also very scary, right? It's like, oh,
Yeah.
well, what did I screw up? Like, what if I did this, would it be
Mm.
even better? But I think it's just important that's why I'm so passionate about studying, and why I wanted to go to
Yeah.
music school, and why I still, like I said, I still have the Adler orchestration book
Yeah.
sitting
Yeah.
there, because I'm trying to always get better, and hopefully one day achieve that, I don't know, what I'm trying to get in my head.
Yeah. Awesome. My orchestration teacher, he had a very specific way, again speaking about brass, but yeah, he had a very specific way of distributing vertically chords within the brass section. So he would always have like trumpets on top, then one trombone, then French horns, and then the rest trombones and tuba. And the reason for this was because he said that French horns, they're not necessarily a part of the brass family. So they don't sound the same way, as close to each other as the trumpets and trombones sound
Well,
like.
you know what? I'll
Yeah.
go even a step further. I think that the two secrets, and I'm just giving away secrets, because you'll never sound like
Yeah.
me, no matter, and I'll never sound like you, no
Yeah.
matter how many secrets we all know. But one is, when you're playing, when it's forte, you need two horns doubling to equal the sound of one trombone
Yes.
or one trumpet.
Yes.
So that's
Yes.
obviously one very important thing. But then I'll take it a step forward further. Bruce Broughton has this great tip where he splits the orchestra into brights and mellows. So brights, for instance, in the strings are violin and cello. They have a more bright sound, whereas the mellows are the viola and the bass. Brights in the woodwinds are oboe and bassoon. They have a much more pungent
Yeah.
forward sound, whereas the mellows are flute and clarinet. And obviously, a clarinet can sound very bright, but in general, and this helps
Yes.
when orchestrating chords. If you want a clarinet to be bright, put it in the bright register. But in the normal clarinet, it's more mellow. And in the brass, the brights are the trumpets and the trombones, and the mellows are the horns and the tuba. And it's exactly like your teacher said, like, the horns don't have the bright power of one trombone, in its upper register, going on like a high B flat or an F. Like, that's a pungent sound that could really play super loud. But that little secret, or not secret, that little method of dividing brights and mellows really helps you understand, just at a fundamental level. Now, again, to be clear, horns, when they're in their upper register playing forte, are very bright,
Yes.
so one has to be aware of this. But that's a great approach, and that gets to why your teacher did that, because he said, okay, the horns can't match the brightness of the trombone up here, so I'm going to put the bright trombone up here, but that's going to get you a very bright sound. So if you wanted a more mellow, rounder sound,
Yeah,
you do the
that's the
opposite,
thing about music. That's the great thing about music and orchestration composition. You have the rules, but they don't necessarily apply to every situation. Yeah. So awesome. All right. I think, well, that's been, a long 1 hour conversation of geeking out.
We'll continue one day. We'll continue one day in the future, George. This is a great conversation. I loved having with you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for agreeing to spend your time and geeking about, music and orchestration. Anything, just as a end of discussion question. You mentioned, yeah.
Curious
Yeah,
what you
you mentioned before. You mentioned before a lot of advice that you could give young composers. So, what advice would you give to young Joe? years
So,
back.
oh man, yeah, I think a lot of what we said in this conversation is very relevant. We talked a lot about business. We talked a
Mm.
lot about approach to creativity. I feel like this was a great conversation in that way, that we really touched on a lot of very important things for young composers. But I think it's also important to, and this is something I'm trying to get better at, is to remember that you need to close the door and forget about that business and try to achieve something great. And something I see happen a lot is that composers, we get so obsessed with the business and obsessed with the psychology of what we do and making money and booking shows, like booking gigs, that all of a sudden, before you know it, you have a team around you and you're doing 8 TV shows, and it's like this thing. But you're not achieving something artistically great. And maybe that's okay for some people, and I don't want to say that's a bad thing. I mean, that's a wonderful thing for people to say, oh, I've 5 TV shows, I have a whole team, and we're all just doing this. It's amazing. It's exactly what I wanted. Great. Nothing wrong with that. But I think for young Joe, I've had a really difficult time. I'm trying to balance it over the years of like finding that perfect balance where I'm working a lot. I have really rewarding, fun projects, but I also feel that I'm giving those projects enough art, and I'm always
Yeah.
trying to deliver. And I feel like just recently in the past few years, I've started to really hone in on that balance, especially with Shadow and Bone and Witcher and these other new projects I have coming forward, where I'm giving a lot of art. I'm being able to close the door and achieve something, but I'm always trying to calibrate that. So I think, yes, the business stuff is important, but always continuously improve your artistic taste and your artistic goals and your artistic capabilities. Know your software, know your orchestration, there is a lot to know that perhaps 50 years ago, you didn't know how to use a DAW,
Yeah,
you didn't
that's
know how
right.
to, yeah, so obviously the task is even more difficult, but there are so many great, talented, wonderful people out there that if you're able to hone in on that and find that voice, that I think there's room for you out here. There's room to be a part of this business.
Mm.
So go get them.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing so much about your process, and yeah, looking forward to hearing about the movie with the voices. What was the name of it?
Spiderhead.
Spiderhead.
Sorry, so it'll be on Netflix.
Awesome. Awesome.
Yes.
All
Thank you.
right. Thanks a lot. Cheers.
Thank you, George.